Ah, buenos dias. ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo estás todos? How are you, everyone? Todos. ¿Cómo estás? Yeah, don't mind me. I'm just doing a little excavation. Underneath that tree over there. Yeah, trying to get to the bottom underneath the soil, because that's how we're going to start off today's class. We're trying to get to the soil of a media system, which we also call cultural characteristics, right? It's that first element of a media system that we're taking on. And we're taking it on just the day before we leave for Mexico. And what I want to try and do in this somewhat freewheeling instructor video is to talk about things that are not talked about in the book, so that I can impart as much as I know about Mexico to you guys and help you understand the culture that exists within which a media system grows up. So first of all, let me just go through the other countries and say a few things about those as well, so that we continue to have a broad comparative basis. We're not just looking at Mexico, we're not just looking at the United States. So we start with the 3 European countries, for example. They all have a lot of things in common. We've got France, we've got Britain, we've got Sweden, and those countries all have parliamentary governments. That's one of the first things that we look at when we look at cultural characteristics. We look at the government setup in the country. So all of those countries don't have as much of an emphasis on the leader of the party as they do on the party that's in power. That's a little bit harder for us to understand. We're used to thinking of Donald Trump, for example, as the face of the presidency currently and as the face of the Republican Party. But though you have leaders of parliamentary democracies in Europe, the party is more well known. So you have these governments in Europe that also have a strong public service dedication to them. And by that I mean that they tax highly, and they therefore believe that as a right of your citizenship in a country, you can be taxed, and then those taxes are used to pay for public goods, like really nice sidewalks. You take a walk on a Swedish sidewalk, it's not like walking down Analomic Street here in East Stroudsburg, let me tell you, where you take your life into your hands, especially if you're pushing a stroller or you're on a skateboard, because the curbs are like this, because private citizens have to fix that stuff in the United States. But in those European countries, you'll have taxation that's used to make your surroundings, at least for people to be able to travel on sidewalks and roads and highways, etc., very, very nice. So that also extends to the media, because in those European countries, they have established very, very big chunks of public service media within the overall media landscape. And by that I mean they have, for example, in Britain, you have the BBC. And the BBC has not one, but 2 channels. And there's only 5 national television channels in Britain. 2 of them are public service channels. Same thing with France. There's only 5. You've got 3 public service channels. Same thing in Sweden as well. Compare that to the US. If we're just talking about television for the moment, you've got PBS. And that's going to be buried in your cable channel lineup somewhere around 21, 22, channel 21, 22. You're not going to come to it till you go click, 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 and go up past a bunch of other channels. Whereas in the European setting, you have those channels readily accessible to you. They're tempting you more often because there's more of them and they're more available. So that also characterizes the European countries. And the final thing I want to say about the European countries before we leave is all of them are surrounded by multiple countries. Even though Britain is an island, only 28 miles away, you've got France, you've got Holland off of Britain as well. Going the other direction, you can go over to Scandinavia off of Scotland. Going the other direction, you can go to Iceland. So there is some proximity of other countries, and certainly that's true of France. France is surrounded by like 9 different countries. You got the tiny little one like Luxembourg, which is a country you can stand and you can see the whole country. It's so small. You can see the border of every aspect of Luxembourg when you stand in it. It's one of many 9 countries surrounding France. And then you've got Sweden, which is a little bit more isolated, but it does have Denmark right there. It's got Germany, it's got Norway, it's got what we call the Baltic countries, which would be Latvia, Estonia, right across the water. So what that does is that sort of makes your media system interchange with other people, with other countries, I should say, because people are traveling between these countries all the time. They're bringing a newspaper with them. They're on their cell phones speaking their native German language, even though they're in Belgium. You know, they're watching films that have come over from Germany, from Italy. There's a lot more interchange going on, and that affects the media content. You're going to have a lot more international media content in those European countries. All right, moving on now to another country. Let's go to China next. So China is, well, the main factor here is it's got a communist government. And the communist government is the only legitimate political party, the Communist Political Party. And what I mean by that is within communist ideology, there is no other legitimate political party, so why even have one run? Because the communist government has, in the views of communist proponents, the communist government has the best interests of the population in mind. And so you trust the government to have those interests in your mind and to provide for you. So people don't question the communist. They never think about the communist. Oh, is the communist government corrupt? Are the political leaders, are they telling us the truth? No, that's not the thought process in China. So in order to preserve that sort of intact immunity from criticism, the Chinese government does not allow a lot of foreign content to come into the country. So that, first of all, no foreign companies can own media properties. That's just not allowed. And secondly, content that comes in is screened out so that it doesn't have too much violence, doesn't have drug references, doesn't show prostitution, doesn't not generally degrade the human being like they would perceive of our programs, like Real Atlanta Housewives, for example. They would say that's a degrading show. That's really taking people and making them look like all they have is money, and they seem really dumb. You know, I'm characterizing that as a stereotype that would be through a Chinese perception. So we cannot ignore the fact that the Chinese government has a strong role in the media system in China. And in fact, there's actually a department of propaganda. Yeah, they have a whole department of propaganda, the Ministry of Propaganda, which is all about pushing out a message about China that's positive to the rest of the world. And it's also about making sure that there is a censorship of people who are agitating for change in China. You're not allowed to go on the internet and say, hey, we need to overthrow the government. You can't do that in China. So the government has a very, very strong role. Also, China is somewhat isolated. It's a big country. It's in Asia. It is surrounded by other territories, but you don't see a lot of migration between that area of the world, not like you see in Europe. All right, so we're going to leave behind China now, and we're going to talk about the United States. And the United States is a very isolated country. We've only got two neighbors. And we got Mexico, which we're currently very wary of, talking about immigration, talking about other things that we perceive as coming out of Mexico, drugs, gangs, etc. So we have limited sort of interest in having interchange with Mexico, except insofar as we buy a lot of products, goods, and services from Mexico. A lot of car parts, for example, made in Mexico. To the north, we have Canada, which is such a small population. And once again, it's almost like the U.S. kind of has a disinterest. Now, I don't mean you personally, but generally speaking, Pennsylvanians have a sort of a disinterest in Canada, or at least not as great as an interest as going to Disney, for example. Far more people will drive from Pennsylvania to Disney World in Florida, which is, a 24-hour drive? Then we'll drive to Montreal, which is one of the nicest, almost European-like cities in Canada, which is only 7 hours away. So that shows you our disinterest. I think it does. And Canadian media, we have a hard time distinguishing as being different from us, right? We see somebody like Jim Carrey, the comedian, or Shania Twain, country music star, or Justin Bieber. We see those people as our own, even though they're Canadians. All right, so now let's move to Ghana, Africa. Ghana, Africa, a very unique country. It's surrounded by three countries that don't speak the same native language. In Ghana, the native language is actually English. It's because of colonialization. Colonialization by the British. They established the English language in a school system there. And if you go to Ghana, that's the main language. And also part of the reason for that, making Ghana unique from other countries in the class, is there are many tribal languages in Ghana where there is no written version of that language. No written version. No written version of your language, no newspaper, no point, you can't read it. And so only oral languages are spoken in certain regions, and that actually makes radio a very popular medium in Ghana because it's such an oral medium, right? So language is a big factor in Ghana, and that means that not only do you have people not the majority of the population, but you still have big chunks of Ghana only speaking oral languages, but then you also have these three surrounding countries like Ivory Coast where only French is spoken. So the language barrier there is going to stop a lot of media crossing back and forth. Also in Ghana, similar to Mexico, up until about the year 2000, it had a dictatorial government. And that's because there was a lot of instability in Ghana, and so the dictatorships established themselves. And in order to control the media and make sure that the media was not going to criticize the dictatorial governments, they would actually put an armed service representative in the booth of a radio disc jockey. Wouldn't say anything, but the radio disc jockey would know they're not going to say anything critical of the government because that military personnel is going to take them away and disappear them. So that's the way Ghana was for a long time until 2000. And then they actually had a democratic election. They've had democratic elections ever since. It's almost 20 years now. But what that means for Ghana in terms of media policy is Ghana is very, very wary about enacting strong-arm media policies, like fining a radio or TV station or newspaper for slander or libel or obscenity. Ghana has guidelines not to do that, but Ghana does not have punitive measures because it's very wary of going back to the past, where everything was so iron fist rule and law and order society with a lot of corruption. So in Ghana, you almost have suggestive media policies than you really have policies. And that takes us to Lebanon now. Lebanon, oh boy, is still suffering the effects of a very, very long civil war that at its heart was a fracture between Christians and Muslims. Now, that's oversimplifying it because actually Lebanon being such a tiny country, it's like the welcome mat to the east. You go across the Mediterranean, you hit Lebanon, you got to go through Lebanon to get to the Far East. If you're going overland, to get to Persia, to get to Saudi Arabia, got to go through Lebanon. So it's kind of been run over in the course of its history by the French, by the English. So Lebanon then had a civil war because a lot of outside powers still have influences in this tiny country. You've got Syria, you've got Iran, trying to influence politics and move more towards Islam, move more towards Christianity. And so Lebanon is a very vulnerable country and actually has very little ability to enforce its own regulations. So you may have a lot of media policies, a lot of media regulations, but people are not following the regulations. They're bribing. Government officials are bribing, or media properties are bribing government officials in Lebanon. But also, since Lebanon has had this history of interchange with the rest of the world, it also has adopted those cultures as well. So if you're a foreign country, you can actually own a TV or a radio station in Lebanon, unlike China. And if you want to show yourself as a high status person in Lebanon, you speak French. Yeah, you openly speak French. It shows that you have an educated and cultural background. All right, time now for Mexico. Well, I have a deep love for Mexico, so I want to preface that by saying that a lot of my comments are going to be on the rosier side to Mexico. And the first thing that I want to mention about Mexico is let's not forget its history in terms of its relation with the United States. Because if you look at the way that Mexico was founded, the symbol of Mexico is a snake in the mouth of an eagle on a cactus in a lake. Can you picture that? A snake in the mouth of an eagle on a cactus in a lake. You'll see that on the Mexican flag. What's that a symbol of? Well, ancient peoples, Aztec peoples, actually originated somewhere in the northwest of the United States. So Utah, somewhere around there, we're thinking. And they were migrating to a place where they could sustain their population, because you're not going to live in Utah, unless you're really resourceful. It's desert. So they were searching for a place that they could settle. And somehow it got started in their folklore that they would know that they found the place when they saw this eagle. So they get to Mexico City. Mexico City has a big lake in the mountains. It's way up high. And they see this cactus with this eagle, with this snake. And they say, this is where we're going to settle. And that's why you have the pyramids that are being built in Mexico City. And one of the things that they did was they drained the lake. So Mexico City used to be a lake in the mountains. Gone now. Still smells like a lake. So that's part of the folklore for Mexico. But it also points out that Mexican peoples, or indigenous Mexican peoples, or Aztec peoples, those peoples were living in the United States as well. And I've mentioned before that Mexicans have a joke. Hey, U.S., you don't need to worry about us immigrating into your country. We're already there. Yeah, Mexicans were living in California, Wisconsin, New Mexico, Utah, Texas. Yeah, they had virtually the whole swath of the Northwest. So there was a famous general. You might come across some stories about him while we're down there, called Santa Anna, the Mexican general. He started the Mexican-American War. And that Mexican-American War resulted in the United States grabbing all that territory and saying, this is going to be U.S. territory now. This is our country. You don't have it anymore. So Mexico gets shrunk. And Mexico, this is now also typical of Mexicans, having the sense of humor that it does, they kind of laugh about this Santa Anna. They shake their head. They're not like really, really resentful that he blew it, that he went to war. And by the way, he had 4 terms in office. They're not really pissed at him. They're like, oh, Santa Anna, you dumbass. He lost the war to the United States. Santa Anna, by the way, was such a megalomaniac. He was in love with himself that in one of the wars, he lost his leg. And he actually had a private funeral service for his leg in a casket going down the street for the public to attend. Yeah, Santa Anna. Anyway, that's where the word gringo comes from, right? So we got Nelson in this class. I don't know if he's been to Mexico. I can't remember, but he's a vet. And gringo refers to green, go home. And that's because the United States during that war, they went down to Mexico City and they occupied Mexico City. And Mexicans down there, noticing the Americans wearing the green camouflage, they started to chant, gringo, gringo home. Now, it wasn't, again, said like, we're really mad. It was said like, please give us our country back. Please go home. That's the way it was. Today, that term has a very fond quality to it. The Mexicans refer to gringos down there as both Canadians and Americans. And it points out the next thing I want to talk about with Mexico, and that is we talk about immigration from Mexico to the United States. You're going to find out when we get down to Mexico that there's a ton of immigration from the United States and Canada down to Mexico. You have people living there full time in Mazatlan. The reason for that is because the quality of life is better. It's softer. People are happier. When you go around Mexico, you won't see lines on people's faces from stress, at least not in Mazatlan. They may not have much money, some people, or they may be working in the resorts because that's where the main jobs are in Mexico, unless you're going to go work in the fishing industry. But those people, they don't have the stresses. They're eating a great diet. They're happy. They're not in a rush. You'll see what I mean when we get down there. So Mazatlan, Mexico, has some of the overall history of Mexico as well, and you'll see down there this huge population of Americans going around all the time, and Canadians living down there full time. Now, the climate is very strange. It makes it hard to live all year round, so it's not an easy feat. Where we are going is what is known as a tropical desert climate. And what that means is from roughly November all the way until June, you can have not a drop of rain. It's just like desert climate. Perfect weather. We're going to have probably 84 to 86 degrees every single day there with a light breeze. But round about late June and July, the humidity starts to come in and you start to get into 96 degree temperature and 94% humidity, and it's unbearable. The sun feels like it's right there in the sky. And you go downtown, you see these curbs that are this high, and that's because the water, when it comes from this tropical part of their climate, it's like gushing all the time. So keep that in mind. It's very difficult to live in Mexico. It's so hot all the way, in Mazatlan, I should say, all the way from virtually July all the way until November. A very hot time period, tropical desert climate. Now, when we get down there, you will see, or you might be able to see, that Mazatlan, Mexico really has 4 kinds of ethnicities, shall I say, that have settled in the area and have given it its unique composition. The first one may be a surprise to you, and that is Chinese. Yeah, Mexico, and particularly Mazatlan, served as a trading port for the Chinese to get to the United States. So they send their goods through Mazatlan, Mexico, and then up to the United States. So there's a long history of Chinese people coming into Mazatlan a long time ago, not in the recent past, but 1700s, 1800s. And so when you look around in Mazatlan, you'll see people that, first glance, they look Chinese almost. They have features that are very Asian. So that's the first group of people. The second group of people would be the Aztec population that I mentioned, and there's actually a particular branch of indigenous peoples called the Nahuatls, and we'll learn more about them. The word Mazatlan means deer, because there used to be a lot of deer that were running around there. You can still find some along the beach in some areas. So that's a Nahuatl word, and so we have Aztec peoples, and you will see a lot of people down there that, like I said in the last video lecture, look like they've stepped out of the 1500s. And they're on the streets. Unfortunately, unfortunate is just such a mild word to describe what I'm trying to describe about them. Is, a lot of them are in poverty. A lot of them have these small children that are selling chiclets and begging, and then those children are bringing back the proceeds to the overall organization. And you'll see some of them in Mazatlan, Mexico. All right, then a third group of people that you have in Mexico is another group that you may be surprised about, and that's Germans. The Germans emigrated to Mexico, and they brought beer to Mazatlan. So you'll have Corona beer, you'll have Modelo beer, and you'll have Corona, Modelo, and there's one other one that they make, Corona, Modelo, can't remember it. There's Tecate, that's not a very good beer, but... So the Germans taught the Mazatlans how to brew, and you'll see the Germans commemorated down there. You'll see some German names down there. And also there's a music form that we'll hear down there all over the place called banda. Banda is this huge 16, 17-piece band with brass instruments. And it has in it, the band, it has a sousaphone, which looks like a tuba. It's a sousaphone, and that comes from Germany. That's an instrument that the Germans came over, and typical of Mexicans, they take their own music and say, yeah, well, you can bring your instrument into our music. We'll just incorporate it. It's still going to sound Mexican. So you'll see that also in the mariachi bands. Those are the mariachi bands. They're the ones that are, wearing these little uniforms, which actually come from Napoleon's army. Yeah, they're too short for them. That's part of the Mexican sense of humor. But they will play everything. They'll play Beatles songs. They do cover tunes. And the mariachi band is a trumpet. And the trumpet's standing over here, and the guitarist is over here. We'll see one of those at some point. So you've got Germans as a third wave of immigrants. And then our fourth and final population is actually happening today. And that's those gringos that are going down there. The Americans that are living there permanently. The Canadians that are living there permanently. So this is what you can expect to find in Mazatlan, Mexico in terms of the history of its peoples. Now, the last thing I want to mention is there was two periods of history which we can see that are affecting Mexico and also the way that Mazatlan looks, and that is colonialization by, first of all, the Spanish, under the Spanish king. Most of you probably know that the Spanish invaded Mexico, the conquistadors, the ones with the tortoise shell helmets, and they were brutal. They wiped out the Aztecs. Then they got to Mexico City, and nobody really knows how they did it. They think that maybe they brought diseases with them that the Aztecs did not have immunity to. That's one theory. But certainly they slaughtered many Aztecs. And they even took the leader, Montezuma. You'll find out about Montezuma's revenge, maybe. It strikes almost everybody. Upset stomach for a day. Yeah, so that's what that's about. Montezuma was captured, put in his own pyramid in Mexico City by the conquistadors. They were absolutely brutal, wiped out much of the population. So they were the first ones. But that also means there's a section of Mazatlan in El Centro that is built by the Spanish, and it looks beautifully designed. The Mexicans do it in their own way. They use a lot of cement to shape ornamentation on buildings. But you'll see it's distinctly European. It looks that way. And then so after the Spanish, then Napoleon defeated the Spanish in the French-Spanish War. And then Napoleon and the French took over all the properties that Spain used to have, including Mexico, or New Spain, as it used to be known. So now Napoleon gets Mexico. And so also downtown in Mazatlan, you can see some French-looking buildings, and you can see French pastries that are sold down there. There's definitely a European feel to Mazatlan because of these two colonial eras. So all of that leaves us with a setting where we can now start to move on to talk about philosophies of media systems. That's what we're going to start to handle in our first class in Mazatlan on Monday, and that's going to extend out of this unique culture that's existing down in Mexico. We'll start to now see what is the thinking of the people who live there in terms of how a media system should operate. Our lecture today won't make a lot of sense in terms of understanding media because, again, we're digging underneath. We're understanding the fundamentals of culture. We have to build upwards before we can have that understanding. But that will get us started. So have a great day, and I will see you across the border.